Poddin My Noggin, hosted by CK Sims, creating a platform to elevate, educate, and heal by creating a space where people can share their stories of struggle, triumph, and redemption. CKS Media.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Poddin My Noggin. We took a short hiatus, but we are back today with Dr. Liz DeBetta. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. Hi, I'm so glad to be here.
Glad to have you here. So your form was quite interesting to read. I'm pretty transparent with my guests, right? So I want them to know that everyone fills out a form, so I have like kind of information and that sort of thing. I had, and it escapes me because I'm aging. I did have a guest, I think last year, whose story was only similar in the adoption phase part of it, but yours is really interesting. So I want to get into that. But before we get into like what you're doing now, tell us about Dr. Liz DeBetta prior to how you got into it.
Yeah. So how did I get to be Dr.
Yes,
Dr.
how did
Liz?
that happen?
Yeah. It's a lot. Well, I'll give you the whole story because, right, we're here to tell stories. So, So I'm adopted, as you know from what I shared with you when I reached out to fill out the forms. But for folks that are listening, I'm adopted, and I have always known that I was adopted, but I never knew the impact of that for most of my life. And so for most of my childhood, I had a pretty normal childhood, all things considered, but I always felt a little bit strange, a little bit disconnected, a little bit like I didn't quite ever belong or fit in anywhere. And by the time I got to high school, I was just kind of like a roiling mess of emotions all of the time, just really overwhelmed by very big feelings. I cried all the time. Sometimes, I put this in quotes, like inappropriately. Like I remember being in like freshman English, and we were reading a short story called The Scarlet Ibis. And one of the characters, two brothers, and one of the characters is one of the brothers is disabled, and I have a disabled younger brother. And the story just set me off, and I just started hysterically crying and had to leave class, and people were like, "Are you okay?" And that was kind of my normal for a lot of years. In around that same time, I had a really smart teacher and coach, Mr. George Anthony, who I am still in touch with and I still talk about all the time, because he saw that I was going through something, that I was having these big feelings, and he suggested that I write poetry. And I thought, well, that is the dumbest thing I ever heard. Because, I was 14 and I was like, I'm not Emily Dickinson. I'm not going to write poems. Come on. What do you mean poems? And then one day we were sitting and talking in his office, and he said, "Can I share something with you?" And I said, "Sure." And so he read me this poem that he had written and that had been published in a literary magazine. And he told me this whole story about why he wrote this poem and what it meant and how he felt, like the reason he wrote it. And I was just like, oh, okay, maybe this isn't so dumb, right? And so then I started thinking like, oh, if this man, right? I had these very gendered ideas also at the time. I had not fully stepped into my radical feminism yet either. Yeah. And so I had this paradigm shift because I thought, well, if this man can be vulnerable and talk about his feelings and use poetry as a way to express some things that are inexpressible, and of course, like those were not words I would have used at the time, but in retrospect, right, I thought, oh, maybe this isn't so dumb. So I got a little notebook and I started writing very secret poems. They were just for me. I just wrote whenever I felt really overwhelmed and I had to get something out. And it was a place for me to put all of this stuff that constantly kept bubbling up. And I never shared that with anybody. It's just my own secret thing. Every once in a while, I would share it with a close friend if I felt like I needed, like, oh, I want you to know this, or I want to, want you to hear this. And I also, at the same time, started doing a lot of community theater. And so being able to pretend to be other people was also really helpful because I got to live someone else's life and I didn't have to deal with the questions that I had about my own life that I didn't even know how to articulate at that time. And so being able to go to rehearsal and live another person's life for a few hours and then perform on stage and put all of that big stuff somewhere was really, really helpful. And so I spent lots of, most of my time really in my teens, writing and doing theater, and actually also being very busy. And I now know that all of that was a trauma response, right? That I was staying busy so that I was managing the external environment so that I could feel safe on the inside. And yeah. So that's a little bit of that.
I have a question for you. So like I'm listening and I'm thinking, for the people at home, like, you talked about, crying and big emotions and sometimes inappropriately. I know how you air quoted it. And I was like, I'm glad you air quoted it, because I'm like, well, they're emotions. So are there an appropriate time? But what, like, as a child, so I have questions for myself because I'm curious. Were you bounced at all, or did you end up in like a stable adopted family?
That's a really good and important question. So I was in a very stable family. I did spend the first about 9 months in interim foster care because I had some health issues that they were trying to figure out. And I was born very prematurely, which was part of the reason for the health situations. And so that sort of first 9 months, I now know, and we now know, is very influential developmentally. And so like there was the disruption with my first mom shortly after I was born. And then, being in the hospital with various caregivers because of being in the neonatal intensive care unit, and then being in this interim foster family, which I know nothing about. I don't know who I was with. I don't know what that was like before going home with my adoptive family. So even though I ended up in a stable family, there were still several significant disruptions early on in my life. And so when I think about those big emotions and the way that things have always affected me, it now makes a lot of sense. Like I, intellectually and emotionally understand why.
There was no bonding, right? You like that security that you would experience in those first 9 months, and even after going to your adopted family, there's still that period of like, you know what I mean? So like I can imagine, I can think to what maybe a baby might experience, right? Like that need, that bonding, what we get, the nurturing, the sort of thing. You were cared for, but by whom and how often did that shift? And you didn't really have a singular person to feel safe with.
Yes.
For people at home, can you describe how, I would, in my mind, as you're talking about, the crying and the big emotions, I would feel like sort of like maybe a heaviness. What is that? How you would describe that period of your life, that your feelings? Was it a heavy or?
Yeah. I mean, the first poem I ever wrote is called "The Little Girl Inside of Me," and I'll share it with you because that I think explains a lot of what I was feeling. Alone and confused, shy and scared, big sad eyes looking out at the world, looking and searching, wondering what's to be. That's the little girl inside of me.
And you were 14, you said?
I was 14. Mm-hmm. I was sad. I was scared. I was confused. I was lonely. Right. So I just felt this deep sense of longing and emptiness that I thought was never going to be filled, and just this deep sadness, which I now know and understand was my unacknowledged grief and loss, right? I was looking for those connections to my first mother and the family that I had been separated from, right? But nobody was talking about it. I wasn't talking about it. I started therapy at that same time, and we never talked about adoption. It never came up. And I stayed with that same therapist for like the better part of 15 years, off and on, like consistently through my teens and 20s, and then off and on through my mid 20s to mid 30s, before I was like, this is not helping me.
Wow. Okay. So you were in therapy. I'm leaning back now. This is my processing phase. So I love that call out to like off and on, right? When it comes to therapy I love that, because for me, people think that you do your say 12 sessions and you're done. But you might make a lot of headway in your 12 sessions, but like, I feel that you're going to need that off and on for a long period of time for healing and just for regular maintenance and tune-up.
Yeah,
They're like cars. They'll keep
exactly.
going for a really long time without care, but we need to do it eventually. So 15 years you were with the same therapist, but okay, I think that that's a really interesting paradox though. Because if you couldn't name what you were searching for and were not focused, although I'm still slightly disappointed in the therapist. I just processing it really out loud. Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. You're right.
like, where's those questions? Like, where, like, those rooting questions to dig deep.
Right. And this therapist also happened to have been my mom's therapist at the same time. So she knew our family dynamic. It's not like she didn't know that I was adopted. She knew. But it speaks to a significant gap in the mental health profession, because there's a distinct lack of adoption and trauma competent therapists. It's not part of most training programs. If they read, a couple of articles about adoption, that's a lot. Most of the therapists that I know that are adoption and trauma competent are adoptees themselves and have grown up and realized like there's not enough help for us. And so they've gone into the field. And if they're not adoptees, they're people that have sought out specific training to become competent. It's nutty. It's so nutty, because here I am, like, and in my award-winning solo show Unmothered, one of the things I say is I spent nearly 15 years in therapy talking about my mother, except I was talking about the wrong one.
It's so interesting to me because sometimes I get a whole big, you know what, we're going to keep with that. I get some big emotions when it comes to therapist, right? I feel like everyone should have therapy in life.
Yes.
Kickstart
100%.
Heal that process. But like, I am not, say, competency trained in the sense that, like, I didn't really know much about adoption until like last year when I had my first guest. I read some stuff on it. But I feel like in therapy, if you're asking the right questions and you're creating that space to sort of discover where these feelings come from, at some point, I feel like I would have gone, even if I didn't know you were adopted, I would have asked you about your younger years. You would have told me, like, okay, well, let's explore this. Like, how does being adopted, feel for you? What does that feel like? Just simple questions to sort of like massage that area of the life. And I look at it as adoption, competency as just cultural competency as well, because...
Thank you for saying that. I say that all the time, that adoption is a cultural competence issue.
Right? Like,
yes.
So just there for me, because while I'm not going to understand, the lived experiences of, say, a disabled person or a person of a different ethnic background, or say someone who's adopted, being culturally competent to know that, okay, let's talk about what expectations are in for your culture, or what did you experience? What was it like to grow up as an adopted child? Like those particular things, really getting into the nitty gritty with that.
Yes, 100%. It's interesting because I have a very distinct memory of this particular therapist who gave me the suggestion that I should become Teflon Liz. Because I had so many big emotions, I had so many feelings, and like I took so many things in, right? That I needed to have like a Teflon suit so that more things could just bounce off of me. And, you know, on the surface, I understand that suggestion, but that wasn't helpful to me as a person who needed assistance, as you say, to uncover why I was so sad all of the time, why I was having these big emotions, why I kept looking for external validation, right? From boys and from eventually men, and, you know, from achieving things, you know, I mean, like,
Yeah, I mean, I get it. I do also understand perhaps where they might have been going with that, but there was clearly like some road mapping missing. Like,
mm-hmm,
right?
yeah,
Let's focus on what we're feeling now and maybe try and Teflon away some of these other things that are happening so we can get to the root of the problem. I don't know. I'm just
yeah,
spitballing. So you were with this person for 15 years.
mm-hmm.
It wasn't helping.
Yeah.
So you had to have made the decision to sever that relationship, the therapeutic alliance, if you will, to do what? What was your next step after that?
Yeah, so I have a very distinct memory of this moment in time, because I had been in another really unhealthy relationship, romantic relationship. And I started going back to therapy because I was like, this, you know, I was having relationship problems. And I thought, well, like every other time, I have to fix me, right? So I called up the therapist again and I said, you know, I haven't seen you in a while, but can I come back? And so we started seeing each other every couple of weeks. And every time I left, I felt worse than when I went in. And I was like, this is not helping me. Like, I don't know what's going on, but like, this is supposed to help give me some solutions and some strategies and some tools and to help me feel better about this situation. And I just feel like shit all the time. And so I just said, okay, well, this is not helping. I'm not going back. And, you know, and I said to her, you know, I need to take a step back because I'm not feeling like this is helping me. And I think I need to figure out some other things. And so there was that sort of, at least I had this self-awareness, right? To not continue to bang my head against the wall in that situation. And then I ended up, you know, I'm lucky that in that I have a really good support network and a lot of long-term friends, people that have been in my life for many, many years, that I'm able to fall back on. And so I started having conversations with my friends about things. And then there was sort of a breaking point in this particular relationship with this man that I was with at the time, where we had an argument that got much bigger than it should have. He said some very nasty things to me. He told me to go fuck myself. And I was like, okay, I'm done. You don't get to talk to me like that. Um, and, and so then I left, within days I was like, I'm leaving. Like I left that relationship. Like I took my cats and I went. And, and then for the next year or so, I started to kind of get into this come to Jesus with myself, is what I talk about it as. Like that I was like, okay, so now I'm out of this unhealthy relationship. I'm back, in my own place. I have some time and space. I like physically safe. And I started thinking about these really unhealthy relationship patterns that I recognized that I had for all of these years. And I was like, hey, I've got to figure this out, because I was, in my late 30s at the time. I think I was about 37 at this point. And I was like, if I don't figure out why I keep choosing these really unhealthy, somewhat toxic, emotionally unavailable, borderline abusive, and actually my ex-husband was abusive, these types of men, like I'm never going to move forward in my life, and I'm never going to have an actual partnership and the kind of relationship that I know that I want. And so I had to then start to figure out why I was making these choices. And my first line of defense has always been education. Whether it's, going to the library and finding a book on a subject and teaching myself about a theory or an idea or a concept, or it's literally like traditional, like going back to school. And I had not finished the last 2 credits of my master's degree, partly because of my abusive ex-husband, which is a whole other story for a different podcast, unless we have time tonight. But I finally had an opportunity to go back to school. And I thought, okay, good, because I know that I need to make some shifts in my life. I recognized that I had these patterns. Maybe, and then I started thinking like, maybe it's time for me to move to a different place and have a different experience of the world. So I'm going to finish this degree and I'm going to go back to teaching because I miss teaching. And so I started to make a different plan for myself. That helped me to feel like I was moving forward, right? Because I was doing something, I was taking action. Whereas before I had felt very, very stuck, it was like a hamster on a wheel going really fast all the time, but not getting anywhere. And so like my response to that was, well, I'm going to do something. So let me finish this degree, and then take these other steps. And so the interesting thing that happened in making that decision was that I, because I had been out of the program for so long, the coordinator of the master's program suggested that I take another class, even though I didn't need it. It wasn't a requirement. But she said it might be good for you to just take the class, be part of the department. So I said, okay, cool. And I don't know, to this day, I cannot tell you why she made the suggestion that she did, but she suggested that I take a class in autobiographical writing. And I thought, that sounds cool. Okay, sure. Sign me up. Let me write my check, right? And I had been writing my whole life, as I said earlier, and, but I had never taken a formal creative writing class. And I was really interested in this notion of like personal narrative and like life writing and, memoir. I was introduced to memoir in that class. And the big project for this semester was to write a long personal narrative. And I was like, what am I going to write about? I don't have a story. I was like, I'm not going to write about my psychotic ex-husband. Like, that doesn't feel good. I don't want to drag that ghost up again. Like, I'm not going to write about my multiple failed attempts to get to the Miss America pageant. That's not something worth writing. I was thinking about, what am I going to write? And then one night in class, one of my classmates was reading her story draft about her sister, growing up with her sister, and how they looked like twins, and they had all these similarities, and people always mistook them for one another. And I just sat there crying. And here's me at 38 years old, fully grown adult woman, like losing my shit in the middle of class. And everybody was like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "I don't think so." And my professor was like, "Well, like, what's going on?" And I said, "Well, I'm adopted. I have no idea who I look like. I have no idea if I have siblings out in the world. I don't know who I look like. I've spent my life looking in the mirror and sometimes feeling like a stranger to myself. And obviously this is touching a nerve because I don't have any idea what this experience is like. And I have no way of finding out, right? Because all my records were closed and I didn't have access to anything." And my professor was like, "Why don't you write about that?" And I was like, "But I don't know anything." And she's like, "Do me a favor, just think about it." And I said, "All right, I'll think about it." Well, guess what I did? I chose to take that suggestion, and I struggled. I struggled to figure out how to tell my own story. And the first, probably 3 drafts were not my story. I kept coming in and she was like, "Nope, that's not your story." And I kept regurgitating the story that I had been told my whole life, right? That external narrative about why I was adopted. And, this, what we call an entrance narrative in adoption. It's like, it helps to legitimize the whole experience and explain to the child what the situation was and why they were adopted and what their place in the family is and all of those things. But it's often incomplete. It's often missing information, and it is often largely fictional. And so I was, telling the story that my mother and my mom and dad had told me my whole life. And I had to figure out how to tell my own story. And I went back to the poems that I had been secretly writing for all of these years. And the poems became my way into that story, because as I started to look at my teenage and, 20-something self and read all of the things that she had written, I was like, oh. And then I went back to the little packet of non-identifying information that I had, which I had had at that point for probably about 18 years, but it didn't hold, didn't have very many clues. So I just kind of had it, but, hadn't really looked at it in a long time. And I went back to it. And in that packet was a list of suggested reading, and which I had discounted however many years before. I was like, "Oh, I'm not wounded. I'm fine. I don't need, And so I started to pick up copies of all of these suggested books, like The Primal Wound and The Journey of the Adopted Self and Being Adopted, The Lifelong Search for Self. And I started reading and I was like, "Oh, I'm not crazy." And I started to feel like, I don't want to say normal, but like I started to have a different understanding of why I had felt the way I had felt my whole life. And then I started to be able to tell my own story. And so the act of really struggling through that class and figuring out how to write that first personal narrative is honestly the thing that got me also, like, that was the sort of bridge into all the things that I do now and how I got to today.
And we're going to talk about more of that in just a few minutes. We'll be right back, everybody.
Partner today with CK Sims and Poddin My Noggin to get in front of an audience that cares. You will be supporting mental health stories, tales of resilience, and uplifting content, aligning your brand with bringing goodness, authenticity, and kindness front and center. This spot could be yours. Do you have a story of struggle and resilience? One that you want to share with others and possibly help someone through their own struggles? Find the link in the show description and fill out the guest form today.
Welcome back, everyone. Before the break, we have been talking to Dr. Liz DeBetta. She has been explaining to us her life leading up to becoming a doctor and all of the things that she does right now. And I really love the breakthrough moment that you were talking about, right? Like the crying class, the professor suggesting that be your story, and then just that process. A couple things I wanted to say though was I love how self-aware you were at 37, right? In the sense that you just knew something needed to be changed, and that you were able to reflect and say, you know what, like, here's a pattern, and if I want to move forward, if I want to do something different, then I have to figure some shit out. And
Yeah.
I love that. I wish everybody could have that moment of clarity, that moment of realizing, okay, because I had my moment, right, at 35, after a life of fuckery, if you will. But 35 was my moment, and I was able to rearrange the stars, I guess, really, in my life, which it sounds like you've been able to do in yours as well. So you had a master's, you did your memoir. No, you already said what it was. Autobiography
Personal.
course, and then a personal entrance.
I wrote a personal narrative. But it was based off of like figuring out how to not regurgitate my entrance narrative.
There we go. And that what's so interesting about that too is that you had the resources to do that for 18 years. You didn't realize.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until reading those books on adoption and identifying the self as an adoptee. I'm paraphrasing, I can't remember all the names, but that you were like, what? This is a part of my story. This is like, wait. I'm like, oh, maybe I am wounded. You had said earlier you weren't wounded, or maybe I do have issues.
Yeah. I mean, because I think I remember, when I initially got that packet in the mail, when I'd sent away for it, I was in college at the time, and I was probably about 21 years old, and had, been having some issues at that point. And a friend of mine said, well, have you ever tried to find your biological family? Do you know anything? And I didn't. And I said, no, I haven't tried, and I really don't know anything. And then she said, well, maybe it would help to find something out. And so that, as I said, I have some really good people in my life, and have had at different ages and stages. And so that at the time at 21, that, inspired me to at least try to get some information. But this was also like, 1998 and, the internet wasn't what it is now. So that, like, when I got the information, there was very little I could do with it because I couldn't search. I didn't have the money that they wanted me to pay them, to help me find information. And there was a disclaimer that there were no guarantees. And so I probably also looked at that list of suggested resources and like looked at the title, The Primal Wound, and thought, oh, I'm not wounded. Like, what is that about? Without having, explored what those titles were about or anything like that. Just kind of like, I'm 21, I've got other shit to do. So I'm just going to keep doing my other stuff and put this away for a while, but then, return to, to some of those realizations and those patterns. And like, I knew like that I had this information, and maybe there was something different in there, or, that something new that I would discover, and being able to then come to those texts and get an intellectual understanding for the first time, and be able to see myself reflected in what those books were telling me that all of the stuff that I have felt my whole life, like there was a reason for it and there was a name for it, and that this very real thing had happened, that I had been separated from my mother at birth and handed over, to strangers. And I don't say that, to be callous or cold. Like that's the reality of what adoption is. And, and then to spend my whole life not talking about it, like we talked about it to an extent in my family, but there wasn't a lot of information. Mm-hmm. And so it just became a thing we stopped talking about. And then it became a thing we couldn't talk about, over time. And so when I started to come into that sort of consciousness about all of this, it was still a very solo journey because I couldn't talk to a lot of other people about it because they wouldn't understand, right? And they weren't going to read those same books. And so I had, but those books and that reading really helped me to situate myself and understand that there wasn't anything wrong with me, right? That there was something wrong with the situation. And like in narrative writing, there's a really famous personal narrative writer, Vivian Gornick, who has actually a whole book called The Situation and the Story. And that's the lens through which she teaches personal narrative, that there's always a situation and then there's the story, right? And so like I was starting to figure that out. Like here was this situation and then what was the story or stories that were attached to it. And how could I start to rewrite that story in a way that made sense to me, and that was about me, that I could be the subject of instead of the object in.
Love this. I love how you said to you, like, most times in life when you were curious or you needed to do something, you just either went and got a book on it or just learned about it, right? And that's why I ended up with a diploma in counseling psychology, not a doctorate or a degree. But I did that because I wanted to understand I was so broken. Right? Like that was the thing. I just like, what is wrong with me? And why? And how can I fix it? And it helped a big amount. And what it also did was prep me for things unknown, like just conversing with people, having conversations, right? Like just listening to people's stories, connecting with them, holding space, like all of that sort of thing. You did your master's, you wrote your personal narrative. How did the doctor part come about?
Yeah, so at the time that I was finishing that degree, I at this point in time, like in that year or so where I had left that terrible relationship and started to begin to figure all this stuff out and then went back to school, I took a big, like probably close to a year break from like dating. I was like, I gotta not even deal with that aspect of my life until I start to figure out some me stuff. And then I was feeling like, okay, maybe I'm ready to kind of start meeting some people again. And I happened to meet my partner, who's my partner now. And we've been together for nearly 10 years. At that time when I was finishing that degree, and about 9 months after we started dating, he got a tenure track job offer in Utah. And so we were living in New York City at the time, and we decided to go to Utah. And I had then by that point, officially graduated with my master's degree. And I knew that I wanted to go back to teaching. And so once we got to Utah, I ended up getting hired to teach at the same university. And, very shortly thereafter, I realized that, this was a thing I wanted to keep doing, that I was really enjoying teaching again. And I loved teaching in higher ed, and it, everything felt good. And I thought, well, if I want to stay in this space, I should maybe think about getting a PhD. And I had always kind of secretly thought about that for many, many years, but I never fully entertained it. I always thought, that seems like a really big reach. I don't know if I can do that, even though I have always been a good student. And so one night I came home and I said, I think I want to get a PhD. And he said to me, why not? And I said, okay. And so I, did some research and happened to, at the time, come across a really progressive and innovative program that was designed for working adults through Union Institute and University. And they had this really interesting interdisciplinary program that was very much focused on social justice and creativity. And that really appealed to me because also I was working full time, and I couldn't step out of full-time work into a more, let's say, traditional, I'm going to put that in air quotes too, more traditional PhD program. Nor did I want to do that, because once I looked at this particular program and I looked at the social justice aspect and the creativity aspect and the interdisciplinary option in humanities, I thought this is perfect because I have a background as a writer, as a performer. I'm also, at the time, I was 40 years old, right? And so I'm not a 25-year-old student, and I'm not maybe going to feel comfortable in another anyway. So I got accepted into that program and made a plan. And I said, I'm doing this in 3 years. And I did it full time while I was working full time, because that's my adoptee superpower. I get shit done. I can, force myself to be very focused. And also the busy helps. But something interesting happened, I'm going to say about a year into my program. My partner said to me, you can't PhD this away. And he was talking about my trauma, and he was talking about so much of the stuff that was still very present, right? That had not been dealt with because I'd broken up with my therapist and, had started to do all this, intellectual understanding and research. And now I was fully researching all of the stuff and getting an even deeper understanding of the culture of adoption and the research on trauma and maternal separation, et cetera, et cetera. And, and I said, I know. And it was at that point in time that I started really fully stepping into the adoptee community as well. And I had gone to the first adoption conference I had ever been to. And I met all these adoptees in person for the first time. And I was like, oh, wait, we get each other. And many of them were therapists. And I went home, and then I was able to reach out to somebody that I had met at that conference who also lived in Utah for recommendations for an actual adoption and trauma competent therapist. So doing my PhD also helped me to, align myself into a more integrated healing journey, because I was doing all of this reading and research, understanding all the core issues in adoption, understanding how that had mapped onto me and my life and the choices that I had and hadn't made, and the things that I, had and hadn't gotten to do, the bad relationships, etc. And I also took a class called Poetry and Healing during my PhD program. And that class, I was like, oh, this is the thing I've been doing my whole life. But I had no idea that there was a whole field dedicated to both poetry as a tool for healing and expressive writing as a tool for healing. So I got really interested in that because in nothing that I read was anybody talking about maternal separation or adoption as significant life traumas. And so I knew there was this big gap. And so what I was able to do with my PhD work was I was able to take my background as a writer, take my background as a performer, and use myself as the subject of my own research. And that's where my solo show Unmothered came from, is that I decided that I was going to really write my story, and then I was going to put it on stage and I was going to perform it for people so that we could start having different conversations about the internal experience of adoption.
That's courageous. and just so you're aware, if you see me moving or doing weird things, I have a puppy at the bottom right here, and so she barks a lot. But let's bring you up real quick.
Hi, puppy.
Her name is Piper.
Hi, Piper.
So to prevent her from barking, I have to sort of like give her my hands and like sort of play with her from barking too much.
It's all good.
About Unmothered,
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna link it in the description. But what I love what you did there, and I'm sure it's intentional. I thought it was before we started talking. I'm more convinced now than I was. But I love how you wrote it. So it's UN-M-othered.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you felt others throughout your life because of...
Yeah. I mean, and that was a completely intentional choice, and good on you for picking that up immediately. Most people I had like ask me about it and I have to explain it. But I love when people ask me about it because it's important. It was like a very deliberate rhetorical choice. The dashes in the word indicate the disruptions that happen in adoption, right? The disruptions and the detachments. So there's a disruption in the relationship and the attachment to the first mother, the biological family. There's also a separation, or you can use the word separation as well. Any of those words fit here. So like the separations or the disruptions or the detachments, but there's also a separation between adoptees and the adoptive families that they end up in. And adoption makes unmothers of first mothers. They become unmothered in the process. And many women who adopt are adopting because of infertility. And so they're, in a sense, also unmothered because they then have to make a different choice about motherhood. And adoption and patriarchy, others, all of us.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so it's about all of those things. Yeah.
Really quite lovely to hear you talk about all of the nuances that are in that title, right? Because I hadn't even thought about or considered the dashes representing disruption, or that Unmothered wasn't just a cheeky sort of way of saying something, but that your biological parent mother was unmothered. Mm-hmm. So that's just very fascinating and very just layered, like delicious. That's the word I'm looking for. It's delicious. You know what I mean? Something you can keep your teeth in and feel like, oh, there's so much to unpack in that. And it's, you know what I mean? But not delicious in like, I don't know. Not what I mean is I'm not trying to be insensitive towards what came to that. What I meant is that it's just a great one. And so this is you have written several books as well. Now,
I have one book and lots of articles.
Okay. So adult adoptees and writing to heal. So that's the book.
That's the
right?
book.
And I thought I saw another book name in here, but maybe that's no. So Migrating Towards Wholeness. I love this as well.
Yeah, that's the subtitle of the book, but now that's the name of my business, and the work that I do is called Migrating Toward Wholeness, which is came out of the book essentially.
So now you're specialized in helping other individuals, people who have gone through adoption. I love that you called out the patriarchy.
Every chance I get.
Yes. Yeah, well, and you had mentioned this already. You went into your feminism and all of those. So I like to always let people know that I am a staunch feminist. Like the women should rule the world, and I just feel like life would be better for everybody, like absolutely everybody. Anyway, that's just me. So now what does that look like for you and for the person who's coming to you for help?
Yeah. Excuse me. So what I've been able to do through the process of writing and performing Unmothered is develop a framework called Migrating Toward Wholeness, which has 5 core principles that are making space to heal, rewriting the truth, expressing the core or primal wound. Oh my goodness, what's the... Come on, brain. Expressing... becoming the subject. That's like the biggest one. I mean, they're all big, but that's like the super important one, becoming the subject and breaking silences, right? And those 5 things are the things that I did in the process of writing Unmothered. Like I knew that I needed to make space to heal, right? And a big part of that was being curious about all the ways in which I felt stuck, right? Which I already talked about. And so each of those 5 core principles are tied to the 7 parts of trauma healing as I define them. And so when we go through the process, so what I do with folks is I work one-on-one. I also work with small groups. And to be clear, I am not a licensed therapist, but I have this expressive writing, this evidence-based trauma-informed expressive writing program that I have developed and now use to help people to attach language to all of those internal experiences so that they can begin to have better relationships with themselves and all the parts that need attention. And then by extension, start to have better relationships with other people in their lives. Because at the core of what everybody I work with, that I get to work with, and it's such a privilege, at the core of their story is that they want better relationships, right? And that's a basic human need. And it's because, so at least for those of us who are adopted, or who have had significant early childhood trauma, there's a missing piece, and there's a lack of a sense of safety. And so what I do with Migrating Toward Wholeness is I create a really safe container in the small group process or in the one-on-one process for people to start to express all of the things that have been unexpressed. And we use 2 specific kinds, actually 3 specific kinds of writing. We do a lot of self-reflection. We use free writing, which is, in my definition, is a radical act of self-permission, because it helps us to unlock ourselves from our critical mind and allow ourselves to just be messy and say what we need to say. And then we use acrostic poems, which become really neat containers for big emotions and help us to process through some of the big stuff that comes out in the other types of writing. And then all that works together over time to help people develop a new narrative. And it's, it helps, our brains are plastic, right? And when we start to establish new habits vis-a-vis this writing process that I teach people to do, that I help people through, that I guide people through, we carve new neural pathways and we migrate into a greater sense of wholeness, because we have a better understanding of ourselves and our stories.
Sounds wonderful, actually. And I feel like that's one of the biggest blocks for people in healing is it's seeming to be an impossibility, first off, like, and the mountain's too big to climb. And then never knowing how to name something, how to identify it.
Yeah.
Or feeling othered and feeling alone in their journey because no one could possibly feel like me, right? Or no one could have these strange thoughts or these weird like emotions.
Right.
But it's one of those things. Like I feel like I said earlier, I'm like everyone should have therapy. People need to talk more, right? And what's interesting, I'll give you an interesting concept, right? Because we were talking about feminism. Men need to talk more, and we need to create spaces where not talk at people, so they do that already very well. They need to talk about what they're feeling and how to identify those things. But that's also another topic, right, for another podcast, because we could talk about that forever. But yes, the identification and why you're feeling these things and where these things come from, all of those,
yes,
you can understand them, they would be able to actually dissect things a little bit better and process emotions.
Yeah. And that's exactly what Migrating Toward Wholeness helps people do. It helps them to make those connections, right? It helps them to attach language to their internal experience, to look at what the language is telling them, to look at, oh, I'm angry, right? I'm writing about being angry, or there's a lot of grief here, like, and start to name those things and figure out what part of the story or what part of the experience they're attached to. And once you can start to name them, you can start to have better conversations. First with yourself. I tell people all the time that when I work with them that what we're doing is helping to create a deeper dialogue with yourself, right? Because if I can have that deeper dialogue with myself, then I can turn to the people that I love and who love and care about me in return. And I can have better conversations, right? I can stop defaulting to my trauma response, which used to be to shut down.
Yeah.
And to avoid and to dissociate, right? I no longer have to do that because I can also, what I also help people to identify in the process is where they're feeling things in their bodies, right? And this is a little bit of the somatic theater piece of the work that I bring into it, being a theater practitioner, being able to think about breath and body and like when emotions are coming up, where are we feeling them, and how to pay attention to that so that we can start to be attuned to our nervous systems and regulate and be able to, use it as a tool to regulate ourselves so that we can move through instead of avoid.
So, question, are you sorry, I can't be bested by her. Then she'll think she's nasty. Just FYI, she's already domestic. So if somebody wants to get involved with your, don't tell me I'm having a moment, Migrating Toward Wholeness, right? Whether it be a one-to-one like this or a small group session, that sort of thing, how would they do that?
Best way to do that is to join my mailing list at my website, DeBetta.com, so that you get the monthly updates and the regular updates on things. I do have a 6-week adoptee-centric group starting in July. It'll run July 2nd through August 6th. So if there's any adoptees out there that are interested in joining the small group, then they can reach out directly about that. People can also email me directly if they're not adoptees but are interested in working one-on-one. And you can either do that by emailing me at dr.liz@lizdebetta.com. And I'm sure all this will go in the show notes.
Oh, yes, it will, for sure.
But they can also use the contact form on my website and set up a complimentary connection call just to talk through what they're looking for.
So your specialization is adoptee, but for everybody listening at home, if you've got some shit going on that you want to work through,
Mm-hmm.
like especially men who may be needing some help
Mm-hmm.
in their lives, perhaps could benefit
Yeah.
from it, actually, because if you're at the point, I think, as a man, where you're kind of like, well, I'm kind of sick of all this, but I've been doing this one way for so long and it's not really working, and you got to
Mm-hmm.
figure out why, perhaps
Yeah. I'm
writing
a really,
migrating towards wholeness.
yeah. I mean, it's true. If and then we still, let's be real. There's still such a deep stigma around therapy and mental health care. And what I can do for people is offer them a bridge,
Yeah.
right? And there have been many people that have come through working with me and have said, this has been better for me than 10 years of therapy. I've made so many more connections that I wouldn't have made otherwise. And again, it's about that dialogue. So, for people that are struggling and that are doing things that don't feel like they're working anymore, and if like you're struggling in your relationships, I can help you be a better communicator, right? I can help you tell yourself and then tell other people a different story and show up differently. Because my whole thing is more stories equal more connection, and more connection equals more healing. So when we know our own stories, we can better connect again to all those different parts of ourselves that maybe have been ignored or silenced or put away. And then we can start to share those stories with other people. And that helps us to connect more with other people. And that's how we heal, is when we're in connection, right? We don't heal in isolation. And so, for anybody that's struggling with wanting deeper connections, I can help with that. And then also provide a bridge into other therapeutic support, because then you'll have a whole lot of language to go into therapy with, right? And you'll be able to know what to talk about. I think that's a big struggle for a lot of people, is they're like, I don't even know what to start with.
Well, that's just it. If you're writing with the free, I think did you call it free text or
Free writing?
free writing? So I should, yeah, that's what I was about to say. I'm like, but I thought there was something. Anyway, with that, like, if we remove the critical component, which we all do, like when I'm writing anything, I'm very critical of what I'm writing. So we stop that creative flow automatically because we're trying to edit in real time. You don't even know what you might uncover when you're doing that. So being able to find things that are deeply rooted in your psyche that can only come out when you're truly free, and then having this experience, you can tell, I keep going back to dudes, but let's focus on adoptees. But for the dudes who are listening, you can tell your friends you're taking, you want to write a book, man, and just doing a workshop.
Yeah.
There you go. Like, it can all be under the radar. You doing
right? Or like get a group, get your bros together and call me. We'll do a special group. Like I'm down for it. Like, let me help you. Let me help you be better.
So
let me help you write that book.
Yeah. For everybody at home, I want to just repeat one thing that you said just now that really resonated with me when I saw your form. Because I feel like it's very much what I'm trying to do here with this podcast. And it's more stories equal more connection, and more connection equal more healing, right? And the more we hear from people and we have those conversations, you just never know who's going to listen or who's going to join or who's going to read and experience some sort of liberation. Just like you did with your books that were recommended in your packet, right? Like you discovered so much about yourself that you were not the one that was the problem, it was the situation. Right? So, okay, for everybody at home, I'm going to link this in the show notes, in the description. So so it's www.lizdebetta.com. You'll get that there. The book is Adult Adoptees and Writing to Heal. The subtitle is Migrating Towards Wholeness, which is also the name of the program that Dr. DeBetta is doing right now. They're on Facebook, and they're on TikTok and Blue Sky and LinkedIn. You're going to find them. I'm going to link you to them. Reach out, get in touch, fill the form, send an email, you name it, and get to writing.
Yes.
Break it down, heal some. That would be wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. DeBetta, for being on my show today and this wonderful conversation. I wish you absolutely great success in this, and that you can help facilitate healing in thousands and thousands of people. As the world needs right now more than anything is you. So
yes, thank you so much. And that is my purpose, to help as many people heal as I can. So thanks for inviting me to have this conversation. This has been super wonderful.
It has been wonderful. Thank you so much. I wish you the best. For everybody at home, until next time, get out there and live your wildest dreams.
For media and sponsorship inquiries, email info@cksims.com or visit cksims.com and fill out the contact form. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. A new episode airs every Saturday. CKS Media.